Hey guys, Dr. Goodin back to talk with you about training principles. What are the principles that we can stick to in training regardless of sport or methodology or general fitness goal or health outcome? What are the principles that really govern the training process? Let's dive right into learning about the training principles. Now, a lot of the information that I will be covering can be found throughout the book, Essentials of Strength Training and Conditioning. However, I've assimilated it all into a single set of training principles that we can see throughout the sports science and strength and conditioning literature as well. Okay, so the first principle is a principle of specificity. And this is really the most important principle because without it, the rest of your training will not produce the outcomes that you are hoping for, okay? And it really centers around this SAID principle, specific adaptations to imposed demands. And what this means is that any organism that experiences any type of stimulus will adapt in the direction of resisting that stimulus in the future. Okay, so what do I mean by that? I mean, if you get up from your seat right now and you begin back squatting, and you back squat every other day, and you continue to do that, your legs will get stronger, your bones will become more dense, your technique in the back squat will improve, but all of that is very specific to that activity. You're not going to get better at running by back squatting. Yes, maybe back squatting will raise your general fitness and it will make you perhaps a marginally better runner, but those gains will plateau very quickly as far as running goes. And yes, you can keep making gains in the squat if you keep squatting, but your running will just kind of stay stagnant. On the other hand, if you get up off the couch and you go and start a running training program, you start maybe a half marathon training program and you're running every day, but not lifting weights or not back squatting, yes, maybe you'll get a little bit stronger, but your actual strength, your ability to exert force is not going to improve very much beyond those first couple weeks as you're subjecting your legs to the pounding and the greater forces of running. That's going to plateau very quickly, even as your running increases, okay? So as we are training ourselves or athletes or general fitness population, we have to keep in mind what type of training is specific to this individual's goals. So this includes movement pattern specificity. So I mentioned the back squat, but you're not going to get very good at bench pressing if you only back squat all the time. And furthermore, even if you're doing push-ups and you're not bench pressing, but your goal is to become a good bench presser, yes, you may strengthen the musculature. Yes, you might have a movement pattern that is similar to a bench press, but without doing the actual very specific bench press movement, you won't become the best that you could be at the bench press, okay? So movement pattern specificity is huge. Also, there's metabolic specificity. So if you're a soccer player and you want to train for soccer, but you are always working on your dribbling technique and your foot touches and your shot power and your shot accuracy, but you're never actually running up and down the field in a full-fledged soccer match or a small-sided game or doing any type of conditioning, then you will not be conditioned with the specificity that soccer requires. Sure, you might have the skills, but you're not going to be able to last the full game. We also have to think about the neuromuscular or kinetic specificity, okay? So this involves the amount and the rate of force development that your sport requires. Is it a sport like shot put where you have to generate massive amounts of force, but more importantly, you have to generate that quickly? Or is it a sport like powerlifting where it doesn't really matter how quickly you generate the force, it matters how much force you generate? Or is it a highly skilled movement like a weightlifting movement where it's not just the maximum amount of force and it's not just the rate of force, but it's also the direction that you're applying that force and how you're moving your joints in concert with the barbell. And then finally, there's also mental or psychological specificity. So if you compete in an extreme endurance sport, but you've never experienced what it feels like to have run, to be at the end of a 30-mile run and you're thirsty and the goo packets that you have don't taste good anymore and your body is just totally thrashed and you don't want to keep going, have you experienced that mentally? And have you trained your mind to continue to will your body forward? Okay, so there's a lot of different avenues of specificity that we have to keep in mind. Now, remember that general training supports specific training. So what I mean by this is the type of training that we do, the type of physical preparation that we do for any given sport doesn't always look like that sport, okay? So for soccer, it's not like we're going to only play soccer to get better at soccer. Practicing soccer is a good start, but if all of our training was just practicing soccer, we would never build up sufficiently the various fitness characteristics that we need to be able to express in a soccer game. Maybe we need to focus on a muscle building phase in order to then have the prerequisite strength that we can then convert into power and then speed on the soccer pitch, okay? And building that muscle and building that strength won't look the same as playing soccer, okay? It will be more generalized training, but that general training is good and necessary as long as it supports a very, very specific outcome for that sport. Okay, so principle number 2 is a principle of overload. So training must be significantly stimulating to drive adaptation. All right, so if you are never training hard, if you're never pushing the boundaries, pushing the envelope of your own physiology, then you will not make the same amount of progress as somebody who is training hard. The reason for this, and the reason why we have to continually overload and continually lift more, train at higher volumes, or run faster times is because of what we call adaptive resistance. This is an organism's ability to maintain homeostasis in the face of greater intensities and volumes of a specific stimulus. So let's go back to the running example. If you get up off the couch and run for the first time in years, that will be a huge stimulus for your body, and you will encounter a ton of fatigue and a ton of great adaptation. But as you run day in and day out, your body will adapt to that, and it will actually undergo what we call adaptive resistance, where now 1 mile or 2 miles of running isn't enough to stimulate an increase in those endurance components. It won't stimulate your cardiovascular system sufficiently. Your heart won't be adapting to have a greater stroke volume. You're not going to be accumulating more blood volume or more hematocrit in your blood. Your muscles might not be increasing their local muscular endurance. All of these great endurance benefits you're no longer going to get because your body is adapting already. And so the overload threshold is being raised. You have to continually surpass that threshold, not with every run, not with every training session, but some days during the week and for some time points, we have to be increasing the work capacity or the intensity of training that we are subjecting our bodies to. Now, that leads well into the next point, which is recovery. The third training principle is recovery, because you don't adapt to what you can't recover from. So what does this mean practically? This means that if you are training with specificity and if you are overloading sufficiently, you have hard training, you have specific training and you have hard training, if you're not recovering from that training, yes, you will improve until you burn out and you get injured. Okay, so we have to take not only rest periods in between, say, sets and reps, but entire rest days where maybe we don't train that day, or maybe that's a pre-planned light day, or maybe a moderate effort day, where we're still getting in some volume of training and some small overloads here and there, or some practice of certain skills while not completely overloading the body at the total organismal level, right? So you're not just completely crushed after these training sessions, so that you can promote recovery and promote that recovery process. We should even have entire weeks of training where we deload, or we have down weeks where the volume and intensity of training is dropping to allow your body to supercompensate, to adapt, and then, to recover and then adapt to that previous, say, several weeks of very hard training. And we have to periodically even take multiple weeks off, maybe once a year or once every couple of years, take 2 to 4 weeks off. Okay, so we're recovering not only, within a workout, recovering after intervals or recovering after a hard set of exercise or a hard run or a sprint repeat, but we're also recovering within the week or the microcycle, where we have certain rest days or certain pre-programmed light days. We're recovering within the mesocycle. So maybe we have entire weeks where the training is down a little bit, 10, 20%, maybe a little bit more. And then even on the macro cycle level, the year to year, we have planned vacations and breaks away from training to allow us to physiologically and psychologically recover from hard training. Now, principle number 4 is variation, okay? And it's number 4 because it's not quite as important as the first 3. If you're training with specificity, you're overloading that training and you're recovering it efficiently, you can make it pretty far. But you still run the risk of injury or burnout or leaving some gains on the table if you don't include planned and strategic variation. So variation promotes long-term success by preventing overuse injuries. Okay, so that's the first thing. If you are continually doing the same exact thing over and over and over, well, you're using your joints in the same way and your muscles in the same way every time. And you can not only become stale, but you can actually create wear on your joints that has the same pattern every single time, out giving that joint or that specific body structure a break. All right, so if you're used to always squatting with a low bar stance, wide stance, toes out, you might do a number on your hips or on your shoulders. It might put stress on those joints. And if you only ever squat like that, then you're never giving those joints a break. If you can give some variation, a planned exercise selection change, right? Going from a low bar back squat to a high bar back squat with a closer stance. Now that's going to continue strengthening those muscle groups, and it's still a squat pattern that you're using, but you're actually relieving some of that joint stress. To use another example, perhaps you're a high jumper. You don't always want to practice your specific high jump approach with the same distance and the same number of steps and the same takeoff velocity every single time. Okay, you want to have much more variation in your jumping patterns than that. Maybe sometimes you should practice the long jump, maybe sometimes the triple jump. Maybe you have certain plyometric workouts where you have multiple jumps in a row, two-footed jumps, one-footed jumps. Okay, maybe you practice, a 3-step approach. Maybe you practice scissor kicking the bar instead of doing, the Fosbury flop. You need some variation. Now, that variation not only prevents overuse injuries, you can also maximize your adaptive capacities. So we know that training the same movement all the time maximally stresses some motor units, but may not even activate other motor units in the same muscles. Furthermore, if you have more movement patterns to draw upon, even if they're very similar, that will help you in the case of, say, a misstep or a jostling from your opponent. You have a greater degree of physical awareness, of spatial ability. You can solve physical problems in more ways if you've encountered more movement patterns in training. Through variation, we can also decrease adaptive resistance. So let's say that you're going for a big bench press and you're always using, your medium grip bench the same way, same setup every time. You get really good at that and it starts to not really stress your body as much. But let's say you switch to a close grip bench and suddenly, oh man, that really lights up your triceps and it's, you find that it's really overloading. Well, that is increasing your ability to adapt to lighter loads, lower volumes of training, and suddenly you find that you're maximizing adaptation and decreasing your adaptive resistance because you've switched exercises. And it also helps to prevent burnout. Training can become monotonous, especially hard training that is always just very specific and the same thing day in, day out. And so by giving some variation, allowing some planned variation, we can help to decrease that potential for burnout. So some things that we can vary. We can vary our exercises using an exercise selection and deletion plan. We can vary the exercise progression. So, do we go from mid-thigh clean pulls to mid-thigh power cleans to a full clean with a front squat? We can vary the load, tempo, set, and rep strategies. So is it heavy loading? Is it moderate loading? Are we having a pause at the bottom of the squat? Are we changing the repetition scheme? Are we changing up the tempo? We can have variation in our training frequency. Are we training 5 days a week? Are we training with double days on some days? Are we going to train like the Bulgarians and come in 3 or 4 times a day? Are we going to decrease the training frequency for a certain period of time? And then also training volume, intensity, and modality. So how much training you're doing, how hard the training is, and even what style of training. So if you are an endurance athlete, maybe sometimes you are putting more training volume towards running, maybe sometimes more training volume towards cycling. Those are different modalities. And we can strategically vary all of these things. Now, the next principle is reversibility. Reversibility is the idea that when you stop training, the gains that you have made will reverse and you'll revert back to more or less an untrained state. And it ties together with the idea of fatigue in interesting ways. Now, some work by Dr. Isirin on block periodization versus traditional training theory. This was published in 2008, but it's based on some of his work from 2004. He details the residual training effects of different motor abilities. Okay, so we have aerobic endurance, max strength, we have anaerobic glycolytic endurance, strength endurance, and max speed. So each of these different qualities has a different residual training effect. And notice that the two that stick around the longest are max strength and aerobic endurance. After about 30 days, you start to lose quite a bit of either aerobic endurance or strength if you don't do any training. And so that's actually a pretty long time. You know, if you think about it, you could go without squatting for a month and then you come back and you still have maybe 90% of the strength that you had previously. Much longer than that, and you'll start losing those gains quickly. Whereas if we look at something like max speed, well, that's, 5 plus or minus 3 days where it starts to fall off. And so if you are an athlete whose very specific outcome is max speed, like a sprinter, well, then you better be touching that max speed quality every few days to make sure that it stays topped up, especially during your competition phase. All right, so the next training principle is the principle of individualization. Some factors of individuals that we should take into account when we're designing a training program for them are biological age. So is this, a 10-year-old that you're training, or is this a 30-year-old? You're going to communicate differently with them. You're going to prescribe them different levels of intensity and of volume. And going right along with that is training age. So is this a 20-year-old that's been training for a decade already? Or is this a 20-year-old who is stepping onto the court for the first time and they've never touched a ball, they've never touched a weight, and they're brand new? You'll train those two individuals very differently. What is the gender of the athlete? So males and females respond slightly differently to training. We'll get more into that when we talk about chapter 7 from the Essentials textbook. But women can tend to train at a slightly higher percentage of their 1 rep max in the weight room. Men, a slightly lower percentage. Women can sometimes train at a higher volume of those greater intensities than men can. For women, you also have to think about their monthly cycle. Okay, so they may not feel the best for 1 or 2 weeks during the month. And we have to figure out, do we modify training or do we keep it the same? And that might be different between different females. What about their genetic abilities, their genetic predispositions? Is this person primarily fast twitch? Are they primarily slow twitch? Do they rely on force production, or do they rely more on their reactive abilities? It's important to assess all of these things as a coach so you can figure out the best approach each individual athlete. And then finally, anthropometrics. Does this person have long femurs, and so maybe a full depth back squat isn't the best for them? Does this person have short femurs, and maybe they can back squat, front squat all day with no low back pain or no low back problems? How tall are they? How short are they? What's their body type like? And is it suited to this event or to this sport or to this exercise? And then finally, the last training principle that I think is the coolest and the most fun, but based on most of the evidence that we have, it's maybe not the most important training principle, is that of phase potentiation. Phase potentiation is the strategic sequencing of directed adaptation and fitness characteristics such that each phase of training enhances and supports the next. So remember when I said that general training supports specific training? Well, that was kind of a simplistic way of saying that each fitness characteristic that we train should then support the next fitness characteristic that we train. So if we think about it logically, if you have an athlete who needs to be able to perform at top speed, let's say a 100-meter sprinter, they need to be able to sprint as fast as they can for 100 meters. We know that in order to do that, you need a really high power output, especially a high power to body weight ratio, okay? So in order to move fast, maybe we should be training power, okay? We know that power would support speed training. And what supports power training? Well, we know that power is force times velocity. So there's a velocity component to that, and there's a force component to that. So maybe if we trained strength to increase your force production, and we also trained with something like plyometrics to increase the velocity, maybe that would increase power, okay? So maybe we have a strength phase of training. And we know then that greater muscle cross-sectional area will improve strength, right? Because now we have more potential for actin and myosin cross bridges to form in a larger muscle. So maybe we should train hypertrophy that makes a larger muscle. Then we teach that larger muscle to be stronger through strength training. Then we take that newfound strength and we learn how to express force quickly with power training. And then now that we are a bigger, stronger, more powerful athlete, now we take that newfound power and we convert it into speed by doing much lower load, but very high velocity training, okay? And so that's just one example of how each training phase, each fitness characteristic that you focus on in training can support the next. And that's what that word potentiation means. It means, potentiation means to make the subsequent activity even better. So here is a graph from Zamparo and Minetti and Pampero. And this is displaying the interplay among the changes of muscle strength, cross-sectional area, and explosive power. So we can see that if your end goal over here is power, well, then maybe first we should start by raising the cross-sectional area, changing your muscle mass, your architecture. And then we also have some neuromuscular factors here. Both of these lead into improved maximal strength. If we can improve our maximum strength, and then we also have some more neural and task-specific and intramuscular coordination factors, those together with the max strength then lead to increased power production. Okay, so that's one example of some of the underlying physiology of phase potentiation. And really, this is what a lot of periodization is based off of. It's this idea that unidirectional training, or at least an emphasis on certain physical characteristics during certain phases of training, can really potentiate future performance instead of trying to train everything all at once. Okay guys, thanks for watching this video about the training principles. I hope it was helpful to get that 10,000-foot view of the training process and to think about some of the guiding principles of training, whether it's athletes, general population, kids, older population. All of these principles apply to anybody who you might find yourself coaching or training. Okay, the next topic we're going to be talking about is biomechanics and how biomechanics relates to strength and conditioning. So click on over to the next video and I'll see you guys over there. If you have any questions, ask it down in the comments. This is Dr. Goodin and I appreciate you guys watching. The lower, now